Hello everyone and welcome to this lecture, Art and the Haitian Revolution. My name is Esther Chadwick and I'm a lecturer at the Courtauld, and I'm really delighted to be spending the next half an hour or so with you exploring this topic. Before we get into the meat of today's lecture, I want to look with you briefly at this painting. This is a work by a Haitian artist, a Haitian contemporary artist, painted not so very long ago in 1995, an artist named Madsen Montpremier. And it depicts events that supposedly took place on the 18th of May, 1803, events that have come to symbolize the founding of the country that we now know as Haiti. So we have here this actions taking place under this strange tree of liberty, a kind of fecund tree, surrounded by angels and by soldiers. And let's go back. And this figure here is a man known as Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And what is he doing? He is taking his sword to the tricolor, that is the French flag of red, white, and blue. And he's slicing out that central panel of white. He's cutting out the white part of the French tricolor flag, ready to hand over to this woman, a Haitian seamstress known as Catherine Flon, who is then stitching back the flag back together again without the white stripe. This is a kind of mythical moment for the founding of the Haitian nation in 1803. Why is this such an important moment? What is the significance of this ripping out of the white part of the flag? Well, Dessalines, this man, like the many people who fought around him for this moment, was a man of African descent who had been born into slavery under French colonial rule. And 1803, now made kind of mythic by this moment, marked the moment when Dessalines and fellow revolutionaries officially declared themselves independent from France and free from the yoke of slavery, of European colonial slavery. The decade or so of struggle throughout the 1790s that had got Dessalines and his fellow Haitians to this moment is known to historians as the Haitian Revolution. So today we're going to be looking together at a number of images produced at the time of the revolution by artists not working in Haiti, but working in Europe, who were responding to these events taking place thousands of miles away across the Atlantic. But also in the very last part of the lecture, we're going to look at how the Haitian revolutionaries themselves might put European art and artists to work for their own purposes, for their own ends. And just before we get into that, I just want to give you a few more slides to give you some historical context, some historical background here, put you in the picture just a little more. Up until this point, this 1803 moment in the revolutionary decade, Haiti had been under French colonial rule, as I mentioned. This was a colony, and this is what we're looking at here, is a much earlier French map, a map produced in Paris in 1723 that shows the whole island of Hispaniola, which the western half of which is what became Haiti. And this is the French colony of what was known under French rule as Saint-Domingue. You can see that here up in the cartouche of this map. This was a colony producing vast amounts of wealth for France, and it was doing that through the enforced labor of enslaved men and women who worked on its many plantations, coffee plantations, indigo plantations, sugar plantations. And in this much earlier 18th century map, we get little glimpses of that labor, even though they're kind of romanticized glimpses. You see this little stack here of sugar cones, a little nod to the products that are coming out of this colony. But how did figures like these, who are marked here as of African descent, get here? Well, this is of course part of the story of transatlantic slavery, and this is just a useful map here because it shows the movement over a number of years of the millions of Africans who were forcibly transported from their homes in West and Central Africa to European colonies in the Americas, including here in the Caribbean. And here, just to give you a bit of geographical clarity, here is Haiti, as it's known today, within the Caribbean. Here's neighboring Jamaica, in the 18th century, Jamaica being ruled not by the French, but by the British, of course. And here, there we go, here's the Caribbean in relation to Britain, France, the rest of Europe here. And this is just a useful slide, just briefly, because it's taken from a book about the age of revolutions in global context. Before, scholars have looked primarily at revolutions happening in Britain, the Industrial Revolution, or the political revolution in France. But actually, if we zoom out to this much broader global picture, in the 18th century, in the sort of from the second half of the 18th century into the first decades of the 19th century, we see these revolutionary events happening all over the globe, these very dynamic moments of historical change. So the Haitian Revolution is absolutely part of that. This is an image actually of the French Revolution that is happening precisely at the same time as the Haitian Revolution. We need to understand these events kind of happening simultaneously, happening in very connected ways. The Haitian Revolution is really deeply connected with the French. This is an image that some of you might be more familiar with, which is an image of the beheading of the French king, the execution of Louis XVI in 1793. Here are some other popular images of the French Revolution from the very late 1780s and into the 1790s. Here on the left is a popular print titled in French, translated as The Awakening of the Third Estate, the Third Estate being the common people. And here you see this so-called commoner rising up from slumber, clutching onto a gun with chains, broken chains. This is an image of the dawning liberation of the common people, which is sort of what lay at the heart of the French revolutionary idea and ideals and actions. And then on the right, we have a really wonderful engraving, another print. So these are images that are circulating in multiple and relatively accessible to many people. This on the right is an engraving. Again, the title is engraved in French here, but it translates to something like, "Man satisfied at having recovered his rights gives thanks to the supreme being." And you can see this nude figure, very classical figure in contrapposto pose, so this slightly bent pose, proudly holding up this document, saying inscribed with "the rights of man." And at the same time, a thunderbolt coming out from heaven, striking down all of the trappings of the old world, the trappings of the Catholic Church, and other symbols of monarchy and so on. There's a crown there being struck and burst into flames by the lightning. The Haitian Revolution was all about a related set of ideals about liberty, about equality, and about recovering what was seen as fundamental human rights. But the Haitian Revolution goes a step further than the French. It is not just the metaphorical shackles, like here, of social inequality and justice, but the real shackles, the actual chains of transatlantic slavery and the colonial system that slavery upheld in this period, that the Haitian Revolution wants to abolish and put paid to once and for all. News about events in the Caribbean, events in Saint-Domingue, soon to become Haiti, began reaching Europe quite quickly after they began. So here's a French print, another print published in 1794, very much around the same date as this French print here, showing the burning of Cap Français, one of Saint-Domingue's principal towns. This is one of the kind of early struggles within the revolution. But you've also got images like these showing the revolutionary leaders for a European audience. In fact, these three works are all British prints, all prints produced around 1802, 1803, just very early in the 19th century, showing one of the Haitian Revolution's key leaders, a man named Toussaint Louverture, a man who worked very clousely with Dessalines, who we opened with. And it's interesting to think about these prints because they're in some ways heroizing Louverture as a leader, which might strike you as a little bit you know, strange given the fundamental challenge that the Haitian Revolution posed to the colonial system, the system that upheld the imperial states of Britain and France and so on. Just a brief look at this print on the left. This is by a Scottish artist named John Kay. It's very interesting that Kay puts Louverture, seen from behind here on this kind of promontory with his ranks of soldiers below, into the pose of the very famous Roman sculpture, marble Roman sculpture, which would have been familiar to many 18th century viewers. It's known as the Apollo Belvedere, and you can see that same sort of outstretched hand. This is a pose and a form that would have been instantly legible as a heroic form. And so the British, interestingly enough, are kind of heroizing the image of Louverture. And I'm not going to go into the reasons why for that now. Having given you a very quick sense of some of the more popular visual images being produced in response to the revolution, I now want to turn to these two works. These are paintings made by artists working not in London, not in Britain, but in Paris. These are two monumental paintings, quite unlike the prints we've just looked at. Monumental paintings with big ambitions, which are designed in their own ways to celebrate the revolution. And just a quick note on the artists responsible for these two works. So on the left is the artist Girodet, who you see in a self-portrait of 1795, rather dapper in his top hat, a white Frenchman working in Paris. And on the right, responsible for this work, is Guillaume Letier in a print by another French artist called Boilly. Now, it's interesting just to note that Letier was actually an artist of color working in Paris. He has his own very interesting relationship to French colonialism because he was actually born in the French colony of Guadeloupe. He was the illegitimate son of a French officer and an enslaved woman of African descent. So his mother was enslaved. And it's hard to see on the painting the Oath of the Ancestors here that we're going to be looking at. But at the base of the plinth just here, if we could see this in person, this painting's actually in Haiti today. Letier signs his name, but he adds that he was born in Guadeloupe. This is a very pointed, drawing attention to where he comes from. So being a man of the Caribbean was obviously quite important to Letier in this Haitian revolutionary context. We're going to come back to him in a minute, but first of all, let's look at Girodet's painting. What are we looking at? Well, we see here a very elegantly attired man, a man whose dark skin and features signal that he is of African descent, African heritage. He's in some sort of landscape setting. We're set high up here, but we can look behind at this receding landscape. There's a kind of air of nonchalance to this figure, and yet at the same time a real strength. So you can see his musculature just coming through underneath his clothing, the muscular thighs here, and this bulging virility here. He is leaning against a marble plinth next to what appears to be a marble sculpture, a sculpted marble bust. And the bust is carved with the words T. Raynal, which identify the bust as a portrait of the French philosopher named Thomas Raynal. But Raynal is not the only philosophical figure in this scene, because our central sitter here is really portrayed as a thinker. Look at that pensive expression and that gaze off to the top right of the canvas. The artist Girodet is really setting up a comparison between these two figures. He's asking us to consider their juxtaposition very forcefully. Now, Raynal, the thinker portrayed in the bust, had in fact written a famous book that argued against slavery and for popular sovereignty and equality. But who was this man in the center of this composition? Well, his name was JeanBaptiste Belle. He was born in Africa, but enslaved and forcibly taken to Saint-Domingue, the future Haiti. But what's he doing in Paris, where Girodet paints this remarkable portrait? Well, he comes to Paris on behalf of revolutionary Saint-Domingue. He's there in the 1790s. You can see the date of this canvas. And he's there to convince leaders in Paris, to convince the political leaders at the heart of power in France to formally abolish slavery. And I think that it's fair to say that this portrait really celebrates and monumentalizes Belle's claim to equality. After all, to be portrayed in oils like this is an ennobling act, an act of recognition in itself. But it also celebrates Belle's claims to be a Frenchman with the rights of other French citizens. And a real key to that is in these details in the painting. If you look carefully at what Belle is wearing, what is this sash around his waist? Well, you can see that it is made up of the colors of the French tricolor. It's as if he's wearing a French flag around his waist. And this is then echoed in the feathers, the plume of his marvelous hat. So this painting is not just a portrait, it is a statement about Belle's claims to equal citizenship, his claims to being both Black and French at this really crucial moment within the Haitian revolutionary decade. We might compare Girodet's grand and very virtuosically done portrait with other kinds of anti-slavery images that were circulating at the same time to help bring out what makes Belle's portrait by Girodet quite so distinctive. Well, we would perhaps contrast it with these images. This is the famous anti-slavery medallion produced by and 4 abolitionists in the late 1780s, originally in Britain, but then you see the French are adopting it here in a French version. And it is a kind of plea for anti-slavery that operates through this question. I don't know if you can make that out, but inscribed on this cameo is the question, am I not a man and a brother? And this is the implied supplication of this kneeling figure here in chains. The contrast between this kneeling figure who's barely wearing anything, basically naked figure, and the standing Belle who is attired in this finery is really, really striking here. There's a real contrast between supplication, between the idea that freedom needs to be conferred by white saviors who answer this question, am I not a man and a brother? And Black autonomy, Black self-determination, self-standing. So just in this very brief comparison, we get a sense of how Girodet's portrait of Belle, yes, it's an anti-slavery image, but it's a different kind of anti-slavery image altogether from other sorts of abolitionist imagery that would have been known to viewers at the time. We now move on to Letier's painting here on the right, The Oath of the Ancestors. Now, this was made 25 years after Girodet's canvas. You can see how it comes in some ways from the same kind of tradition. These are both artists working in Paris in the late 18th century into the early 19th century. Same kind of approach to these monumentalized human figures with their dramatic poses. We've got certain similarities of composition as well, with this kind of suggestion of a raised platform and the receding landscape beyond. But there are some really crucial differences. Even though these paintings come out of a very similar moment and respond to the same events and certain very similar questions, there are some crucial differences in the ultimate message they convey, I think. So let's take a closer look. Well, what do we see here? 2 men either side of what seems to be a kind of stone plinth, a kind of altar-like structure. And in this middle ground here, below them, a crowd scene, a mixed crowd. There are some people with white skin, some with black skin, some people who seem to be of mixed race in this crowd. Seems to be a scene of celebration, looking up to these 2 figures in the foreground. And then in the distance, we see these scenes of, there is a cannon here and rows of ranks of soldiers. It seems to be the kind of aftermath of war, of battle. And in the foreground, this really telling detail of broken chains, the discarded remnants of slavery. The 2 men in the center of this composition were key figures in the Haitian Revolution. On the left is Alexander Pétion, a man of mixed African and European heritage. And on the right, he is again, this is the Black leader, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Now, this picture wasn't intended for a Parisian audience, an audience in Europe, but in fact a Haitian one. And I mentioned earlier that it's in fact in Haiti today. This was delivered as a gift to the Haitian people in the 1820s. This is quite some time after the heady years of the revolution itself. So it's a kind of retrospective celebration of the revolution. And what it celebrates is a crucial moment within the revolution when free people of color, like people like Pétion on the left, swore allegiance, not with the whites, but with the Black revolutionaries, with people like Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And you can see that they interlock their arms and outreach their hands in this moment of oath-taking together. But whereas Girodet's painting seems to depart really quite drastically from conventional abolitionist imagery, distancing itself from the idea of the naked enslaved man in supplication with his hands in prayer, Letier's painting, despite celebrating this really radical political event, stays closer, I think, to a much more traditional paternalistic idea in which freedom from slavery needs to be sanctioned or blessed by white authority. And I think that's implicit in these cameo images, these medallion images, but I think that's really nicely brought out in this, again, another French print. This is a French print from 1789 on the far right of your screen, which shows a crowned female figure blessing kneeling enslaved men in chains in a pose very similar to what we see in this abolitionist medallion. And why do I say this? Well, look at this figure who presides over Letier's canvas. The act of oath-taking by these two revolutionaries is ultimately presided over by a very white Christian God who blesses the oath. So there's a tension in this canvas, in Letier's canvas, that although it celebrates the revolution, the Haitian Revolution, it at the same time retains a traditional hierarchy. And look at this triangular form of the composition, very hierarchical composition in some ways. It retains that hierarchy of the old regime. Before we end, I want us to just have a quick look at another use for European art in the wake of the Haitian Revolution. This man on the left, Henri Christophe, Henry I, King of Haiti, was probably born enslaved in the British-ruled Caribbean island of Grenada, but he lived his life in what was to become Haiti. And he fought in the Haitian Revolution alongside Dessalines, alongside Louverture, whose images we've already looked at. After Dessalines' Declaration of Independence in 1803, that moment of ripping out the white from the French flag, there was a very turbulent period of power struggle in the new Haiti. But in 1807, Christophe, this man, emerged as the leader of the northern part of the new country. And in 1811, he declared himself king. This was a really remarkable act. He called himself the first crowned monarch in the New World. But although he was promoting and established a new kind of society, or wanted to establish a new kind of society based on that radical Haitian revolutionary premise of anti-slavery and racial inequality, he in fact turned very consciously to European artists, and particularly to British artists, to create the imagery, the aesthetics, the look and feel of his court and of his kingdom and of his symbolism. So we're seeing here on the right of the screen, this is his Palace of Sans-Souci, constructed from around 1806 to 1813. This is, you can go and see these ruins today in Haiti, in the northern part of Haiti. The palace was destroyed after the fall of his kingdom, of Christophe's kingdom, and then later again in a major earthquake. But nonetheless, what remains shows us just how Christophe was looking to European forms of architecture to express his new form of power. This is very much in the form of a European style classical palace. And this painting on the left, if we were to compare this with portraits of the same period made for European rulers, European sovereigns, we'd see many overlaps with this luscious red curtain, the crown here on the cushion, and Christophe's full-length pose in a Europeanizing costume. Well, Christophe actually had this painting, he commissioned this painting from a British artist, an artist who had trained and was working in London, who he actually had sent over to Haiti to paint him there. And then once the painting was finished, was completed, it was sent back again across the Atlantic and it hung on the walls of the Royal Academy in London. This was the most prestigious place that you could display art in London at the time in 1818, and it acted as a kind of virtual avatar for Christophe and for his assertion of presence on an international stage in Europe, and specifically in Britain, in London in this case. There were other British craftsmen to whom Christophe, this former revolutionary, had turned to, again, to furnish his court. So we're looking here at a plate at the center of which is Christophe's symbol, the phoenix. So this idea of the phoenix, the bird that rises again from the ashes, rises again from the flames, is reborn, a symbol very much of the revolution as a kind of rebirth. And you can see that, well, this is actually a plate produced by none other than the Spode manufactory in Stoke-on-Trent in the Midlands in Britain, and then sent to the Haitian court. And you can see that phoenix device reappearing here on this magnificent coin. This is the obverse, the front, and this is the reverse, the back of a single coin, and showing Christophe very magnificently as a Roman emperor with laurel wreaths in his hair, and very forcefully proclaiming him the King of Haiti by the grace of God. But again, this coin was actually produced by a British engraver. It was engraved in London by a man named Thomas Wyon, originally produced at the time of Christophe's coronation in 1811. And of course, if we compare the coin, so here's the front of it, the obverse again, showing the portrait of Christophe, we can see just how very strongly it makes it conscious links with the tradition of European royal coins that ultimately go all the way back to classical Roman and Greek antiquity, showing the sovereign with this classicizing dress, with this armor, and as a kind of Roman emperor. So rather than reject European forms, Christophe, the King of Haiti, the man who had been born into slavery, or at least into a system of slavery, who had risen through the ranks of Toussaint Louverture and the revolutionaries in the 1790s to fight for the independence of Haiti, rather than reject the European forms in some, that you might think symbolized everything that the Haitian Revolution stood against, he actively embraced them and appropriated them in order to convey the image of Black power and Black sovereignty that the Haitian Revolution had so forcefully put into motion. So I'm going to leave it there with that whistle-stop tour of objects and images from the Haitian revolutionary moment. There's clearly a lot more that we could say about all of them. And if we were together in a lecture room, we'd have a Q&A now, and I'd hope that you have loads of questions and we could have a discussion. But I hope this lecture has given you a taste of the ways in which both artists working in Europe responded to the Haitian Revolution as it unfolded, and the importance of the visual arts to the communication and celebration of its aims. Thanks very much.